if slavery was the necessary jet fuel to start to ignite the Industrial Revolution, then why didn't it happen in Africa? There were more slaves held in Africa than anywhere else. How come they didn't become the first to industrialize?
Black slaves lived 9 years longer than people in the north of England. That's how tough it was in the north of England compared to being a slave on a plantation. England became a wealthy nation and a world leader and a powerhouse because it raped, it pillaged, and it stole wealth from across the world. That's the only reason why England is a first world nation. They stole it from other poorer nations.
Oh, 2 points to that, right? Uh, yeah, well, it's undoubtedly the case that Britain did achieve some wealth through the ability to trade with the empire. No one's denying that. But let's look at it this way. Firstly, there's an argument put forward that slavery somehow fueled the Industrial Revolution. This is something you hear very often. Were it not for the slave trade, Britain wouldn't have become this powerhouse and wouldn't have become an economic giant through the Industrial Revolution. I'm sorry, the only reason Britain was able to embark upon a successful slave trade was because it was already a rich country. Having a global slave trade it happens to countries that are already rich. If slavery was the necessary jet fuel to start to ignite the Industrial Revolution, then why didn't it happen in Africa? There were more slaves held in Africa than anywhere else. How come they didn't become the first to industrialize? What about on a closer to home? Why didn't the Spanish or Portuguese become the first industrial nations? In fact, they became economic backwaters, yet they were involved in slavery before the British and had comparable sized hordes of slaves. Similarly, how come countries like Germany and Switzerland and Sweden were able to industrialize, given that they didn't have a global slave trade? So, I mean, the arguments there are very silly. In 1792 was the top year for sugar trading. Now, sugar was the main reason for slavery within the British Empire. In America, it was cotton and so forth. But Britain, it was sugar. Now, in 1792, capital formation for sugar was only 3%. In other words, only 3% of investment was going of British investment was going into sugar. If sugar and slavery was such a hugely important part of the British economy, they should have had 30% of investment going in there rather than only 3%. In fact, if you look at the impact of slavery on the English economy, it's essentially the same as was contributed by barley and hops. And nobody I've heard has said that beer fueled the Industrial Revolution, and yet they were entirely comparable. Yes, look, slavery made some slave owners hugely wealthy, and that's where the confusion lies, because if you go around England, you will see these grand stately homes which look very impressive. You'll see universities or museums founded with the philanthropy of the wealthy slave owners, but that's on an individual level. In terms of the national wealth, that money was inconsequential. It wasn't hugely important. Another point here, more broadly, aside from slavery, often people will talk about, for example, India and the fact that India had a share. And I forget the exact figures here, but I'm just making this up now. But India had 40% of global GDP was Indian before the British arrived. After the British left, India's GDP had collapsed to a very small percentage of global GDP. And somehow they're doing this correlation as causation. But that's not correct. What happened was the rest of the world's economies grew, and so proportionally, of course, the size of the Indian economy fell. In the same way, in the 1950s, the United States of America's global share of GDP was vastly higher than it is now. Now, is someone saying that America is a victim of colonization and somehow America has been pilfered by the global economies? No, it's just a fact that China and India and other countries have risen, and that's lowered America's global share of GDP. Another way to also look at it, one of the things that is often said is that 43 trillion, I think it's $43 trillion was stolen from India by the British. That was put out by rather ridiculous Marxist historian. It's been completely blown out of the water by serious Indian economists who've looked into all of this in great detail and far better qualified than I. But essentially, what they say is, well, firstly, that number is completely nonsensical. There's no justification for that number whatsoever. But most importantly, what they looked at was, well, the money leaving India, which went to Britain, for example, would that money have necessarily stayed in India had the British not been there? So they looked at what the Maharajas were doing, because India was only governed partly by the British. There were other parts of India the British weren't governing. They were governed by the Maharajas. And there's no actual difference in the amount of money that was being invested in the Indian economy by the Maharajas before the British arrived or after the British arrived. So you actually can't make that argument.
There's two things I found out recently about slavery, which you'll probably already know. The first one was, if you look at America, you split America in half. Northern America, as in the United States of America, the northern part didn't have any slaves, and they were industrialized, the big cities. And then you have, the southern states, which were heavily used slavery. And then you ask yourself, which was the richest part of America, United States of America? It was the northern part, because they industrialized. Slavery wasn't the panacea to wealth that we think it was. It kept people only at a certain level of wealth, where technology, innovation pushed people even further, and hence why the North won the Civil War. They had the Civil War. Yeah. And the second thing I learned recently was, at the height of the American slave trade, on plantations in Alabama, Black slaves lived 9 years longer than people in the north of England. That's how tough it was in the north of England compared to being a slave on a plantation. No way am I saying it was good to be a slave. I'm just saying everybody had it bad in most places across the world.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And this is why the call for reparations from Britain is so nonsensical and so unjust, because we had a Caribbean judge who sat on the International Criminal Court. He was one of the International Court of Justice, rather. He was one of the guys who ruled on the Chagos Islands. He was the one who put together this report, this panel that said Britain should pay, I think it was $18 trillion in reparations for slavery, which is more than the entire GDP of China. We somehow managed to find down the back of the sofa. But he wants British taxpayers to pay that. Now, why should British taxpayers pay slavery reparations when, out of a population of millions, there were only a few thousand slave owners? The vast majority of people living in England descend from people who lived lives of abject poverty akin to serfdom, exactly, not that far off from slavery. Horrific conditions, horrific lives. So why should their descendants pay reparations to people in the Caribbean and people in the Americas, where, quite frankly, you can't even prove that they necessarily descended from the slaves? But there's no fairness and no justice there whatsoever. On the contrary, as abhorrent as slavery was, and slavery was absolutely horrific. And if slaves were alive today, then we should absolutely pay reparations to them, because they are the living victims. But the great grandchildren of slaves are not victims at all. In fact, the richest element of the black diaspora are African Americans. People living in America who are black are the wealthiest black people in the world, closely followed by Canadian black people and black people living in the UK. By every measure you look at, the lives of the descendants of slaves today are far better than if their ancestors had never left Africa.
Yeah, I completely agree. If someone has to pay reparations, it should be the descendants of the African kings who sold their brothers, sisters, cousins, and neighbors into slavery in the first place. For me, the buck stops there.
Yeah, well, and if the English slave-owning families want to give some of their wealth, that's up to them, But it's not for the British taxpayer to pay any of that.